Nerina Lorne was known as the elegant, soft-spoken wife of renowned architect Keiran Lorne. But when she walked into a police station one quiet autumn morning and calmly confessed to pushing him off a cliff, detectives uncovered a secret so dark, it turned a picture-perfect marriage into one of the most disturbing cases of psychological torment and revenge ever recorded. Keiran Lorne was the kind of man people envied. He had the charisma of a public speaker and the mind of a master architect. In the quiet town of Fallridge, he was nothing short of a celebrity. His sleek, modern buildings stood out across the state, and his face occasionally appeared in glossy magazines under features titled Architect of the Future. He lived in a home he designed himself, an angular glass structure that stood alone at the edge of a forest, as if it had been delicately placed there by nature itself. The house was a masterpiece, but it was the man inside it who really caught people's attention. Keiran's wife, Nerina Lorne, was equally captivating, though in a quieter way. A retired botanical researcher, she had left behind a promising academic career to focus on art. She painted mostly abstract pieces, moody, swirling patterns of color that always seemed to suggest something deeper. Her gallery showings brought indecent money, but it was Keiran who always shone under the spotlight. Nerina never seemed to mind. She stayed in the background, smiling gracefully, hosting dinner parties and organizing charity events with the same precision she once applied. In her laboratory, together, they were Fallridge's golden couple. People admired how their personalities complemented each other, Keiran's boldness balanced by Nerina's calm. Their social media accounts were filled with pictures of vacations in Iceland, elaborate garden brunches, and long hikes through misty woods. They looked like a fairy tale brought to life. The kind of love everyone wanted. The kind of life that felt untouchable. But on the morning of March 12th, everything changed. At 6:45 a.m., a hiker discovered Keiran's body at the bottom of a ravine that ran behind the Lorne property. His skull was fractured, his neck twisted at a strange angle. His clothes were neat, as though he had dressed for a normal morning. His phone lay beside him, still intact, with unread emails waiting for response. The authorities were called immediately. By 8 a.m., the area was cordoned off. Detectives and forensic teams arrived. Nerina was notified. She answered the door wearing a robe, her face pale and stunned. When told of her husband's death, she did not scream. She only nodded and sat down, staring at the floor in silence. At first, the death was labeled as accidental. There were no signs of forced entry at the home. The security system had not been triggered. Keiran's car was still in the garage. There were no defensive wounds on his hands, and no indication of struggle. It looked as though he had fallen, perhaps while walking in the early morning darkness. People mourned. News outlets published glowing obituaries. Friends gathered at candlelit vigils. Nerina, draped in black, stood at the edge of it all with dry eyes and trembling fingers. But something about her behavior unsettled the investigators. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She didn't speak much at all. When they asked her about her husband's routine, she gave vague answers. When they inquired about their relationship, she responded in rehearsed phrases. She spoke kindly about Keiran, but there was no warmth, no emotion. Still, without evidence of foul play, the case couldn't move forward. The body was cremated, per Nerina's request. The ravine was cleared. The case was filed as accidental death due to fall. Life, it seemed, would go on. But in the days that followed, whispers began to surface. People who had once envied the couple now recalled strange details. Times they had seen Nerina staring off into the distance, her hand twitching slightly. Moments when Keiran had spoken too sharply, too coldly. Guests who visited their home mentioned feeling a strange heaviness, an unexplainable pressure that settled in the chest. Then, 10 days after the funeral, Nerina walked into the police station, with an envelope in her hand. Her hair was combed, her coat buttoned, her steps steady. She asked to speak with the lead detective, then waited quietly. When she was taken into the interview room, she placed the envelope on the table and pushed it forward. "I think you should reopen the case," she said. And with that, the truth began to crack through the illusion, revealing something far more disturbing than anyone in Fallridge had imagined. When Nerina Lorne walked into the Fallridge Police Department that morning, no one expected what she was about to reveal. She wasn't frantic. She didn't carry the grief of a widow seeking justice. She moved with the stillness of someone who had already made peace with what was to come. The receptionist noted how pale she looked, as if her skin hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. Her eyes were dull, almost hollow. She didn't ask to speak to anyone in particular, but her voice was firm when she said, "I have information about my husband's death." Detective Hollis, who had overseen the original investigation, was called to speak with her. He remembered Nerina from the day Keiran's body was found. Back then, she had said very little, choosing instead to nod or offer brief answers. She'd seemed distant but not suspicious. Now, sitting across from him, she looked directly into his eyes and slid a thick envelope across the table. Inside were handwritten notes, photographs, and a floor sketch of their home. Most surprising was a letter Nerina had written in her own hand, detailing a chilling account that shifted the nature of the entire investigation. The letter opened with a single line: "Keiran's death was not an accident, but I am not the one you should fear." That sentence made Detective Hollis pause. Over the next several pages, Nerina explained how the image of her husband, the world, adored, was only a fraction of who he truly was. To outsiders, Keiran was a brilliant architect and a generous partner. But behind the closed doors of their immaculate home, he had become something else entirely. A man obsessed with control, secrecy, and manipulation. She described how, in the first few years of their marriage, things had felt normal. Keiran was intense, yes, but charming and attentive. He planned everything, from their meals to their vacations, but Nerina had taken it as a sign of his affection. It wasn't until her health began to decline that she started to question things. She experienced frequent dizziness, memory lapses, and nightmares that left her shaking. She assumed it was stress, or early signs of neurological illness. Keiran insisted on handling her appointments himself. He told her the doctors found nothing wrong. When she asked to see reports, he told her not to worry. He said it was anxiety and that she should rest. But over time, the rest became confinement. She stopped going to her art studio. She stopped meeting friends. She stopped questioning him. And she didn't know why. It wasn't until she found one of Keiran's notebooks hidden behind a false drawer in his study that the pieces began to fall into place. Inside were careful records, not of buildings or design concepts, but of her behaviors. Page after page listed dates, times, and her reactions to specific drinks or meals. Her emotions were measured like data points. He had been drugging her. That much became clear. Even more disturbing were references to Phase 2 and emotional rewiring. The entries weren't written in the tone of a concerned spouse, but in the detached language of a researcher observing a test subject. There were even references to a small room in the basement, one she didn't know existed. She wrote in her letter that she hadn't dared confront him. She feared what he might do. But she began secretly collecting evidence: hidden cameras, photographs, audio recordings. She built a timeline. She mapped out every step. On the night Keiran died, Nerina claimed she had not planned to kill him, but she had followed him into the woods, watched him from a distance as he dug another hole in the ground. When she approached the site later that night, she found a sealed container. Inside were botanical extracts she recognized from her own past research, potent plant-based compounds with psychoactive properties. He had used her own knowledge against her. That discovery, she said, broke something inside her. She no longer felt fear, just a cold clarity. The next morning, as Keiran stood near the edge of the ravine, she watched him for a long time. When he turned away, she stepped forward and pushed him. Now, seated in the interview room, she told the detective that she wasn't asking for forgiveness. She just wanted the truth known. She had lived as a ghost in her own life for too long. Whatever consequences came next, she would accept them. All she asked was that someone finally listen. And with that, the case that had seemed so simple turned into one of the darkest stories Fallridge had ever seen. Detectives followed the details in Nerina's letter with growing disbelief. Her confession had opened the door to something far more disturbing than a simple domestic tragedy. When she mentioned the hidden basement room, no one was quite sure what to expect. But they obtained a warrant and returned to the Lorne home. With a forensic team, the house, once admired for its beauty, now seemed sinister. The glass walls that once let in light now felt like a trap, offering no privacy and no escape. The entrance to the hidden room was carefully concealed behind a bookshelf in Keiran's study. It blended so seamlessly into the design that it would have been impossible to notice unless someone was looking for it. Behind the shelf was a narrow staircase, steep and unlit, leading down into a cement-lined space that felt nothing like the rest of the house. There were no windows, no decoration, and no natural light. The air was cold and heavy, as if the room itself held on to secrets. The room was small, barely 10 feet across, but what it contained chilled the investigators. Along one wall was a stainless steel cabinet filled with vials, pill bottles, labeled droppers, and a carefully catalogued index of substances. Everything was organized in the cold, clinical manner of a research lab. Many of the labels listed the Latin names of rare plants, most of which had sedative or hallucinogenic properties. Others were completely unfamiliar. On a metal table in the center of the room were 3 leather-bound journals. The contents were shocking. Keiran had documented everything. The journals spanned nearly 6 years. They began with harmless-sounding entries, observations about Nerina's mood, her diet, her sleep patterns. But as the pages continued, the tone became colder, more scientific. He referred to Nerina not as his wife, but as Subject N. He charted her reactions to various dosages, recorded changes in her perception, tracked her increasing confusion and isolation. He wrote about how certain chemical combinations made her more passive, less curious, more compliant. The most disturbing part wasn't the experimentation, it was the intention behind it. Keiran hadn't just been curious about the effects of natural compounds. He had been conducting a long-term behavioral conditioning study. He wanted to prove that with the right combinations of chemicals and psychological reinforcement, a person's sense of identity could be reprogrammed. And he had chosen his own wife as the subject. One entry in particular stood out to detectives. Dated almost a year before Keiran's death, it read, "Subject N is showing resistance. Periods of lucidity are increasing. May need to accelerate. Phase 2. Memory manipulation less stable than anticipated. Consider isolation reinforcement." It became clear that Keiran had known Nerina was starting to fight back. He was planning to tighten control, to break her will entirely. Further evidence emerged in the form of photographs Nerina had included in her envelope. Images of bruises, marks on her skin, and screenshots of messages she had tried to send to friends but that were never delivered. Forensic analysis would later reveal that Keiran had installed spyware on her phone and blocked outgoing communication without her knowledge. Her isolation wasn't a coincidence. It had been deliberately engineered. One of the more haunting discoveries was a soundproofed chamber adjacent to the main room. It contained a reclining medical chair, overhead restraints, and a small tray with dried plant residues. Investigators could only speculate what had taken place there. But one thing was certain. Nerina had not imagined her suffering. She had been a prisoner in her own home, slowly broken down by a man the world saw as perfect. The media got hold of the story within days. The basement lab of Fallridge became a trending headline. Commentators debated whether Nerina was a murderer or a survivor. Experts in criminal psychology called it one of the most disturbing domestic abuse cases ever documented. But amidst all the noise, the truth remained simple and horrifying. Behind the walls of a designer home, a man had turned love into a laboratory and a woman into an unwilling experiment. The hidden room was no longer a secret. It was a crime scene, one built on obsession, control, and cruelty, disguised as genius. As the investigation deepened, Nerina Lorne's story began to ripple beyond the boundaries of Fallridge. What had started as a tragic death transformed into a national conversation about psychological abuse, control, and the terrifying reality that danger often wears a charming face. Nerina had confessed to pushing her husband into the ravine, but as more evidence surfaced, so did a complicated question. Was it murder, or was it survival? Detective Hollis faced a dilemma. The physical evidence supported her claims. The secret lab, the journals, the toxicology findings that showed traces of rare plant compounds in Nerina's bloodstream. Her body had, for years, been altered without consent. Psychological evaluations painted her as someone who had been deeply manipulated, subjected to long-term trauma and coercive control. But Keiran was dead, and Nerina had made the decision. That ended his life. The prosecution team hesitated. Legally, the case was complex. There was no precedent strong enough to clearly define it. On one side stood Nerina's admission of guilt. On the other, a mountain of evidence suggesting that her actions were a direct result of psychological torment. She had not snapped in a moment of rage. She had calculated, observed, and chosen. Yet her choice had been forged in captivity. Public opinion split into factions. Some viewed her as a hero who had reclaimed her autonomy. Others saw her as dangerous, capable of silent vengeance. News segments replayed clips of Nerina leaving the police station, her eyes forward, her face unreadable. People studied her body, language, debated her sincerity, and questioned what they would have done in her place. Meanwhile, in a quiet government lab 2 counties over, forensic scientists conducted a more thorough analysis of the substances found in Keiran's basement. What they discovered was unsettling. Some of the compounds had no documented history. They weren't just rare, they were unknown. According to specialists, Keiran had been experimenting with hybrid extractions, blending traditional botanical elements with synthetic enhancements. These weren't just sedatives. They were mood-altering agents capable of impacting memory retention, emotional processing, even moral reasoning. One compound, later dubbed Lorne 3 by the lab team, showed the potential to dampen fear response. In lab rats, it left subjects disoriented but calm, open to suggestion. The implications were chilling. Keiran wasn't just conducting unethical tests. He was developing methods of psychological suppression. Some experts speculated he was preparing for commercial use. Others believed it was purely personal, a twisted attempt to shape the perfect partner. All of this painted Nerina's act in a new light. If her thoughts, fears, and emotions had been chemically influenced for years, could she truly be held accountable by the same standards as someone of sound mind? Was it still murder, or was it the final act of resistance? Her lawyers filed for diminished capacity. A court psychologist testified that Nerina suffered from complex PTSD and dissociative symptoms directly linked to prolonged chemical exposure and emotional abuse. She wasn't insane, but she had been systematically deconstructed and rebuilt under someone else's control. Her sense of self had been tampered with, not metaphorically, but literally. The judge called it one of the most disturbing cases he had ever presided over. The jury listened, silent and shaken, as photos of the hidden chamber were displayed in court. They read Keiran's journal entries, cold and clinical, describing the woman seated before them like a subject in a lab report. The courtroom at times felt more like a memorial for Nerina's stolen years than a trial. In the end, the jury delivered a verdict of not guilty by reason of diminished responsibility. Nerina would not walk free, but neither would she be imprisoned. Instead, she was ordered to undergo psychiatric care in a secured recovery facility. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't punishment either. It was, perhaps, the first step toward healing. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited for a statement. Nerina didn't speak. She simply looked up at the sky, something she hadn't done without fear in years. For the first time, no one was controlling her next move. The facility where Nerina Lorne was sent sat on the edge of a forested ridge, miles away from the town of Fallridge. It wasn't a prison, but it wasn't freedom either. The structure resembled a quiet retreat center, with wide glass windows and walking paths that curved through tall pine trees. Yet beneath the surface calm, every hallway was monitored, every room locked after dark. It was a place meant to offer healing, but within controlled boundaries. For Nerina, it became the first place she could begin to understand who she really was. Her first days there were mostly silence. The other patients were distant, and the staff interacted carefully as if trying to gauge whether she was dangerous or simply broken. Nerina didn't speak much. The act of telling her story to police, to lawyers, to a courtroom full of strangers had exhausted something deep inside her. She spent hours staring out the window of her room, watching shadows move across the grass, trying to reconnect with time and space after years of disorientation. Therapy sessions began slowly. The doctors didn't push. They asked open questions and waited. In one session, a trauma specialist asked her not about Keiran or the basement, but about the last time she remembered feeling joy. Nerina had paused for so long the therapist almost repeated the question. Then she finally whispered, "I used to paint clouds." It was the first honest piece of herself she had shared in years. Over time, she was allowed to visit the facility's small art room. At first, she only observed. Her fingers ran over the brushes but didn't touch the canvas. Then one day she painted. The result was simple, a swirling gray sky with no horizon. But it was hers. It wasn't part of someone else's experiment. She chose the colors. She made the brush strokes. In that moment, she took a step toward reclaiming her identity. While Nerina slowly rebuilt herself within the safety of the center, the outside world continued to reel from the revelations of the case. Keiran's architectural firm collapsed within months. Clients withdrew, horrified by the connection to what media now referred to as the Fallridge lab case. Employees came forward with stories of Keiran's obsessive behavior, his micromanagement, and his refusal to let anyone enter his private office. No one had ever imagined that within the sleek walls of that home, a secret life of control and cruelty had been unfolding. Several psychology programs across the country introduced new coursework around the case, using it as a modern example of coercive abuse and chemical manipulation. Ethics panels debated the line between psychological study and human experimentation. Some called Keiran a monster. Others, chillingly, called him a genius. But one thing was certain. His work would never see daylight. The basement room in the Lorne residence was sealed permanently. The property was seized by the state, and a decision was made to demolish the home entirely. When the walls came down, workers described an eerie stillness inside, as if the house itself had never been meant to breathe. What was left behind was nothing but foundation and soil, stripped clean, but never innocent. Months passed, and Nerina continued her therapy. Her memory remained patchy in places. There were still nights she woke in fear, uncertain of where she was. But with each passing day, she grew stronger. She was no longer just the woman who had killed her husband. She was no longer the subject of someone else's story. She was beginning to write her own. Eventually, her doctors recommended limited, supervised outings. Her first walk through a public park was brief but emotional. The sky overhead stretched endlessly, untouched by walls or glass. For the first time in years, she felt wind on her face that wasn't filtered through vents or planned by design. She wasn't being studied. She wasn't being controlled. She was just a woman on a path, learning to live again. The world would always remember the horrifying details of what happened behind the walls of Keiran Lorne's home. But Nerina's journey did not end there. Her story was not one of tragedy alone. It was one of endurance, resistance, and the long, painful path toward reclaiming a stolen life.